Welcome to the next edition of Grid Pulse. I'm Bryce Yonker with Grid Forward. Today we have with us Jim Matheson. Jim is the CEO of NRECA. Jim, thanks for being on.
Appreciate the opportunity.
So I'm going to let you describe your acronym. I do know what it is, but if you don't mind, give us a little bit of a background on who you are, what led you to this role. By my count, I don't know if it was short or it felt long to you, but I see about 14 years there in Congress. So tell us about yourself and what's led you to the role at the helm of NRECA.
Sure. Well, I'm currently the CEO of NRECA, and it's a 5-letter acronym, National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Been here about 10 years, but my career has been in the energy sector or the public policy sector since I left business school. I started out in the independent power business, developing power plants, switched to working for an energy consulting firm that worked with a lot of commercial and industrial large energy users. And then I served in the United States Congress for 14 years from the state of Utah. Was on the Energy and Commerce Committee when I was there. Really enjoyed that. And looking for when I left Congress, I wanted to go and work in a place where I could go back into a management position, but also keep a foot in the public policy world. And so the association world sounded interesting, and there are a lot of associations based in the Washington, D.C. area, but there aren't very many that are in the energy space as well. And this position opened up at the Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And I happen to have a long-term relationship with electric cooperatives, particularly ones back in my home state of Utah. And so it at the time seemed like a great fit. Now that I've been here for 10 years, I found that it's a great place to work, and it's an honor to represent roughly 900 electric cooperatives that exist in 48 states.
Well, congrats on the decade. I started with Grid Forward in 2014, so we've been running in similar lanes for a little while here. So my first question, as you know, there are actually a couple thousand providers of electricity across the U.S., and in large part because of how many co-ops and public power operators we have across this country. How did we get to this structure, and how is it working for us right now?
Well, without giving too detailed a history lesson, the way we really got here was in the early days, people followed the money, and the money was where the population was. And in the 1930s, when FDR was president, he recognized that roughly 90% of all of rural America did not have electricity. He created the Rural Electrification Administration to try to help finance building out in rural America. Even then, the for-profit utilities said, no, it's not worth it. So what happened is people in these rural areas each put in $5 to form their own cooperative. And so cooperatives, by definition, are owned by their members that they serve. And that's how cooperatives got started back in the 1930s. We're talking 90 years ago. Today, it's not all rural. What was rural in the 1930s now is a lot of suburbs as well. But at this point, rural electric cooperatives cover 56% of all the land mass in this country, serve 42 million people. And as I said, there are about 900 of them. And as you said in your question, there's also a number of municipal utilities, public power in this country, some large like Los Angeles or Jacksonville, Florida, and a lot that are smaller as well.
Yep. So that was a big effort, roughly 90 years ago, kind of a bottoms up, as you were saying, approach, as well as a top down approach. There were some significant federal investments. We'll talk about what's going on the federal side in a little bit right now. So smaller and generally more rural utilities have a big lift on their shoulders as far as what they need to do to keep the power on. How do they do it? Right, often they're pretty small teams, and it's amazing work that they get done. How do they make it happen?
Well, first of all, the word cooperative has meaning. They actually cooperate with each other, and a lot of our cooperatives are broken out in two categories. We have larger ones that are called generation and transmission cooperatives, and they're the ones that own the big assets. They own the power plants. They own the high voltage transmission lines. And there are about 60 of those in this country. And the other 840 are what are called distribution co-ops. And those are the ones that are providing low voltage electricity directly to homes, businesses, farms. The distribution co-ops are often served by one generation and transmission cooperative. They actually are the owners of that cooperative, if you will. And they're the board of that G&T cooperative or all the different distribution cooperatives. So while each individual distribution cooperative, some of them may be quite small, they band together. It's this confederated system, and that gives them the opportunity to have very local control, but at the same time be part of a larger scale operation. And what's interesting about the co-ops also in terms of how they do this heavy lift, it's a model where in most states they're not regulated. They don't have to go through rate-based hearings for the Public Service Commission. They actually have the ability to be quite agile and nimble in trying new things, deploying new technologies. So sometimes being small is an advantage.
Absolutely. So I had a question that gets into that G&T role that you were alluding to. So roughly, you said 60, but the vast majority of smaller grid operators are too small to own and operate their own generation infrastructure. So how is that ecosystem of providing electricity generation capabilities, how is that going? Is that meeting the needs that co-ops have these days? How's that working right now?
In the moment, it certainly is. Now, not all electricity that's ultimately delivered to end users through distribution cooperatives comes from electric cooperative owned generating assets. There's a certain amount that's just bought in the marketplace or through power purchase agreements from independent power producers. There's also a subset of distribution co-ops that are served by TVA. And there's 52 distribution co-ops in the Pacific Northwest that are served by the Bonneville Power Administration. So they're not all served by the generation and transmission cooperatives, but about 80% are. And through either company-owned generation or market purchases, and sometimes it's spot market, sometimes it may be longer-term power purchase agreements. That's how the supply has happened, and that's how distribution co-ops meet their needs. And the model has worked really well.
Obviously, well, obvious to me, but power prices change from location to location. But from what I've seen, on average, the cost of delivered power from co-ops seems to be pretty darn competitive. Do you see co-ops, being able to, I guess I'll use the word outpace, but you can change me if you want, the rest of the affordability kind of dynamics that the energy system is facing?
Well, it's an interesting question. And of course, different locales have different pricing dynamics, to say the least. But a couple things about co-ops. At one level, it's a little counterintuitive that co-ops have competitive pricing because co-ops are serving the most difficult, most expensive places to serve in America, where the population density is so limited that, in some places it's as little as 2 people per mile, whereas in cities that's 70 or 80 people per mile. So you get the sense of scale of all the infrastructure to serve just a few people. That should drive the costs up more when you stop to think about it. And yet electric cooperatives remain very competitive on pricing, often are the best deal in the state. One factor may be that we are non-for-profit utilities owned by the consumers we serve. We have no shareholders. The consumers not only own the co-op, they govern it. They elect people to the board. So the governance of electric cooperatives is 100% through the lens of the best interest of the consumer only. And the consumers are interested in having lower electric bills. So I think that helps manifest these lower rates that you're mentioning. It's just that cooperative model in general.
And it is a bit counterintuitive. So I'll just reiterate it. A couple customers per mile versus dozens of customers per mile. One would think that the economies of scale would make the large companies consistently more competitive, but the data does not show that. The small co-ops definitely compete on price. So is there something unique or maybe difficult when it comes to offering innovative capabilities in that model? Because they are smaller, right? So each person has to wear a lot of hats. So how are maybe new or innovative deployments generally done within the frame of the co-op community?
Yeah, it's really an interesting question because when I first got introduced to electric cooperatives, I thought, oh gosh, they're so small. Maybe they're really behind on technology and innovation. And what I found is the opposite. In fact, when you serve, as I said before, the hardest, most expensive place to serve in America, sometimes technology is really the only way you can do it well and cost effectively. And so let's take a technology that's not new, but it's been around for a couple of decades, automatic meter infrastructure. It's really smart metering. Electric co-ops embraced that early on. We have greater penetration of AMI across all co-ops in America than the investor-owned utilities do in America, because it makes sense for these small dispersed operations. As I said earlier, we're not regulated. Sometimes that means we can make decisions quickly. We don't have to go through a rate making and rate based process. We have an ability to, at scale, to try new technologies and deploy them. And finally, because cooperatives actually really do cooperate with each other, there's an ability for this information sharing that is really powerful. And they know sometimes they can't do it on their own. That's why they come together. That's why the National Association here at NRECA exists, is to help convene all these people together and help them function in a more cohesive way to get benefits of scale. So I've actually seen innovation embraced by electric cooperatives in substantial ways.
We've watched a lot of AMI deployments across the co-op community, and it makes a ton of sense. If you're going to have to roll a truck to manually read a meter, of course, you're going to get more value if you don't have to do that virtually. But what also is exciting is some of the, I guess I'll call them add-on capabilities. So the customer portal, the demand side management applications, you don't have any of the difficult aspects that an IOU might have to try to align their incentives with that of their customer. A co-op's just serving its customer. And so I've seen some pretty cool deployments that go above and beyond. Is there anything that another highlight outside of, is there any situational awareness, any other automation capabilities besides AMI that kind of come to mind over these last few years that have been interesting for you to watch?
We actually end up electric cooperatives because we serve more than half the country. We have lots and miles and miles and miles of distribution lines. And often they're covering rugged areas. So one thing where we've really embraced, and the rest of the electric sector has too, is aerial reconnaissance, drones, satellite imagery for conducting inspections, for vegetation management. And as the wildfire issue becomes more and more of a risk in the utility system, using technology to help mitigate that risk has been essential. And co-ops have really leaned into that in terms of that aerial surveillance for veg management, right-of-way management, and inspecting lines.
Yeah, we've done some symposiums on wildfire mitigation, and our last one on AI last year. At the very top of the list, I said, no brainer. Let's use AI to optimize our assets, right?
Yeah.
We can collect data really, really efficiently, and it knows what a cross arm looks like, and it's going to tell you where to dispatch your crew rather than just, finding a needle in the haystack. Maybe we'll pivot over to some of the federal areas. I know we've been in collaboration with you all on some of these, and you guys are deep in that area. What our community probably doesn't appreciate that you all are right in the thick of is at the Department of Agriculture. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about RUS and why that financing and some of the work that's going on there is so critical for the co-op world.
Yeah, I think the average citizen in this country, when they think of federal government and energy, they think of the Department of Energy. But look, when Roosevelt first created the Rural Electrification Administration, at that time there was no Department of Energy, but there was a Department of Agriculture that had all kinds of programs for rural development. So it made all kinds of sense to create what was back then called the Rural Electrification Administration. It's now been renamed the Rural Utility Service, or RUS. It's a very critical partner to electric cooperatives. It's a lending institution that, in my humble opinion, is the most successful infrastructure financing effort the federal government's ever had in the history of this country. It makes money for the taxpayer. There is a review. You can't just go get money willy-nilly. You have to go and prove creditworthiness, prove the viability of the project, go through permitting review. But it's an important source of low-cost financing for these rural areas. We don't have equity. We don't have shareholders. Everything's financed by debt, if you will, in the electric co-op world. We maintain on our balance sheet a certain amount of equity, but if we have to raise more capital, there's only one way to raise it, and that's more debt. And the Rural Utility Service has been a critical partner in affordability for investing in our electric system, and in the last few years, also in the broadband space, because a lot of electric cooperatives are offering retail broadband just like they offer electricity.
And by scale, are we talking often tens of billions a year? It's a pretty big program, is it not?
It's a program that Congress sets a limit on how much can lend, and right now it's around $7.5 billion, but they have this ability to bump it up another 25% if the demand is there. And I'm here to tell you right now, in this day and age, with what's going on in the electric sector in this country, it's up. And we're actually talking about going back to Congress to see if they'll raise that overall borrowing limit, also because inflation has driven up costs of so many of the supply chain components of the electric system. But I feel like we're on solid ground to ask for that increase because of the track record of this is a program that actually makes the taxpayer money. We pay our bills back. And co-ops are a great bet in that regard. And so RUS, as critical as been since the 1930s. I mean, isn't it amazing? We're talking about something created 90 years ago. It's really important today. It still matters.
I mean, is it too much of a hyperbole to say we wouldn't have rural electrified America and all the economic development that has come from that without such a dedicated program at the federal level?
It's hard to imagine what would have happened in the timing it did, for sure. Again, hardest, most expensive place to serve in America. You needed some kind of financing ability with the federal backstop to make it work. And it would have been difficult to go to the private sector when an entity has no equity, especially when you're starting out as a cooperative. And by the way, this isn't just ancient history. We had a cooperative that started in the early 2000s on the island of Kauai, and they started with zero equity. And the Public Service Commission asked a lot of questions about, wait a minute, how does this work? You got to have equity. And they said, well, over time, we do build our retained earnings and our equity in our balance sheet. But yes, we start out with zero, and we borrow from the Rural Utility Service through the federal government, and that's how we invest in our system. And here we are 20 years later, and the Kauai Cooperative is a great success.
You mentioned a surge in demand. It's probably unique. It's certainly unique in my tenure in this industry, and probably a few decades before I entered this industry. And it's electrification of transportation, it's industrialization, there's manufacturing reshoring, there's electrification of industrial processes. So there's a lot of things that are in motion, but the one at the top of the list right now is data center development. Are a lot of these larger electrified loads also coming into rural America? I kind of know the answer to that, but when they are, how are co-ops navigating that?
Well, they are because, they use a lot of land, and rural areas, that's more accessible for the data center developer. There's a long history of data centers, quite frankly, in the Mid-Atlantic region. Virginia is kind of the ultimate data center concentration in this country right now. And a lot of those are served by electric cooperatives. So we actually have a lot of experience historically with data centers. But what's changed now is the size. Now we talk about these hyperscalers. And, what used to be a 50 megawatt data center, 100, now we're talking about 700 megawatts or a gigawatt, and it's like, whoa, that's a big change in scale. When you ask how co-ops are dealing with it, I have to say, first of all, there's not a one size fits all for how it works. Everything is local in terms of the location and geography, and if they're long or short on electricity in that part of the country or transmission capacity. That being said, electric cooperatives are looking at I probably like the rest of the electric industry in understanding that they want to protect their existing consumers. They want to see that data centers, as is often I think that's the talking point I hear in politics, pay their fair share, but the devil's always in the details. These are important contractual relationships that require a lot of thought. And by the way, the data centers are bringing value to the table as well. My gosh, they have a load that runs 24/7. So all that time when electric utilities have underutilized assets in all the off-peak hours, now you've got someone to take power then. A lot of data centers are going to buy a whole bunch of backup generator sets. If they have a contractual relationship with the utility, can also dispatch those. That's value to the utility. So I just offer a couple of examples where both parties need to sit down at the table and figure out if there's a relationship that makes sense for both of them. That's the classic definition of a successful negotiation. Every negotiation is going to be a little different, but electric co-ops are trying to approach this in that context of how do I do right by my existing consumers who are also my owners, if you will, bringing on this large load, which represents both a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities.
I'm sitting here in the Northwest. I think you're in the DC area. Those are some of the hubs, not only of data centers generally, but co-ops serving data centers.
Yeah.
Are there some other places you're starting to see it bubble up? And is the way that they're tackling it different or similar than their peers are doing it?
I made reference earlier about where you're long on electricity, maybe there's more latitude to make these negotiations the way you're short on electricity in a particular state or region. So folks with excess capacity that's underutilized, those utilities are probably in a more flexible position to negotiate with data centers than not. But that being said, man, it seems like data centers in some ways are going everywhere in this country.
That's kind of what I was assuming.
We see a lot in Texas, and we see a lot in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. So that the whole eastern seaboard in Texas.
And the upper Midwest.
A lot.
So you can include agriculture, but DOE and some others, the last handful of years have really opened up more resources than had been available to rural utilities. Utilities of actually all sizes than had seen for some decades. And then in the last 18 or so months, let's just say things got complicated. They may have gotten stuck. Are they getting unstuck? Are we seeing a flow of the federal programs coming to co-ops? Kind of where are we at on the flow of those dollars?
Yeah, let me break it into two different categories of where these, quote, newer dollars are for electric co-ops. One is only for co-ops, and it was in the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's actually still the Department of Agriculture. I mean, it's called the New Era Program, and it was $10 billion, $9.7 billion, but I rounded to $10 billion just for electric cooperatives, and that was for direct grants for 25% of the cost share of new investments in generation. So it was oversubscribed. So all $10 billion was subscribed, which represents $40 billion of investment. When the new administration came in, there was a pause on a lot of programming, which new administrations often do. I have to say, the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary Rollins, has been very understanding of the value of these projects, and she's moved to release the funding for all that with USDA. But the second category of spending I want to mention is at DOE, and that was through what was called the infrastructure bill back during the Biden administration. And there's a lot of different funding streams for the electric sector in general and for small utilities like electric co-ops and munis specifically. And yes, that slowed down when the pause happened. But I have to tell you, we're seeing a lot of funds being released right now. And just very recently, the Trump administration Department of Energy announced their round 3 for the GRIP program. They kind of changed the focus a little bit to reconductoring, and it's more focused on transmission. But those funds are starting to move. So yes, there was some delay. Yes, there was some uncertainty out there, but we're seeing a lot of money start to move.
Yeah, and some of the GRIP stuff did get canceled,
Yep.
and some of it is stalled. Our community is very familiar with GRIP, but SPARK is going to be the new acronym for everybody as of last week, and a very specific focus, as you had mentioned, reconductoring. We're wishing that very, have high hopes. There's certainly a lot that can be done there.
Tired of costly grid upgrades and unpredictable demand? Virtual Peaker's AI-powered virtual power plant software empowers utilities to maximize the value of distributed energy resources. The cutting-edge platform optimizes DER operations, enhances grid stability, and unlocks new revenue streams. Learn more at virtual-peaker.com. Now back to our episode.
Let's cover a few other things that are in flight in the industry. I mentioned last year we focused on AI. It's a bit odd to me that, the organization whose mission is focusing on advanced capabilities, we're dedicated to affordability this year. But I think there's no doubt that it's kind of the trend that we need to dive into. So maybe you have a few thoughts on this topic. As advanced grid systems, kind of inarguably come with advanced benefits, how do we make sure that those capabilities in modernizing the grid aren't putting pressure up on rates, right? That we keep the North Star of affordability, right in line while we're bringing advanced capabilities onto the system.
First of all, it's the right motivation and the right question. And there's a history where technology's created efficiencies, cost efficiencies, operational efficiencies that are real. The question is this next generation going to manifest itself in that way or not? Because part and parcel with that, at the same time, we're seeing it feels like every component of the supply chain that serves the electric sector is experiencing inflation over the last 5 years, way above the general inflation rate. And you could talk, like I say, it could be large, like a gas turbine. It could be a crossbar or a meter at your house. Everything has really felt this significant upward pressure in pricing. And so I don't think hope's a good strategy, but, partly we do need to hope that there are abilities to apply new technology, be it artificial intelligence or other advanced technology in a way, to realize meaningful efficiencies that address this affordability issue, because this affordability issue is real. It's one where I think we talked earlier about how for years the electric sector really kind of was flat when it came to demand across this country. All of a sudden now it's like, whoa, this
demand
is
and cost, right? The price was pretty flat too.
And so this is an industry that culturally and operationally hasn't been dealing with a rising price environment for a long time. And now it is. And so I think that that's an interesting challenge for all electric utilities. As I've said before, electric cooperatives are owned by the consumers they serve. So affordability is absolutely front and center for their governance and their operations. Then you talk about what about just the price of fuel, the price of power? Where do natural gas prices go? Hard to control that.
Yeah.
Hard to control that. What we are looking at doing on the policy side to help with affordability, which is not in the advanced technology context that you asked your question, but we're trying to find ways to be more efficient, effective in how we do go about building new assets, because the permitting process in this country drags things out forever. It's very difficult to build things in this country. And we all know we got to do better. I'm not saying we get rid of environmental permitting review. We should review everything and make sure it's an appropriate. But there's got to be some time limits, some appropriate designation of authority where one entity's in charge so you know what's going on. There's got to be some boundary around legal review as well. You can't have these, we all heard of electric transmission projects that are 20 years in the development stage, just getting through all the permitting. That is a driver of cost that's significant for all the new infrastructure we're going to be building in this country. So I got off your advanced technology and into permitting, but I think they're both relevant in terms of cost control.
Well, I'll take the bait on that. Speed Act is a step in the right direction, but it doesn't touch transmission and some of the like really key areas that the energy infrastructure ecosystem wants to see. I heard somebody with a trusted perspective on this put, the possibility of comprehensive permitting reform at about 35%. I would have put it at like 5 or 10%. What's your kind of take on where we're at? I mean, it always seems to be the next energy package.
I guess it depends on what time frame we're looking at, but we are in an election year, and often that's a year where less gets done than more in Congress. Yeah. But you've identified also the fact that the SPEED Act is a good piece of legislation, and we're all for it. But the permitting issue isn't going to be dealt with one piece of legislation because there's so many different statutes on the books that in one form or another you'd put in the category of permitting. That the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Historic Preservation Act. There's this list that goes on that are going to require different pieces of legislation to deal with them. And oh, by the way, that's just at the federal level. And then you've got state and local permitting and siting issues as well. So the permitting issue is one that's going to take a concerted effort with perhaps multiple policy advancements to get there. I do see more of a consensus in a bipartisan way than we did in the past. It used to be industry wanted permitting reform and the environmental side didn't. Then the environmentalists suddenly saw that it's really hard to permit a solar plant, so maybe there is a problem here. And I think there's more of I'm grossly oversimplifying when I give that as the example, but there is more of a consensus. And that means there is an opportunity. Now, you mentioned one in particular, and that has to do with transmission. And on the permitting side, I think there's an ability for us to reach some consensus on moving the permitting forward. But here's the catch. Everyone wants to load other issues onto it. And the most challenging, complicated issue to load onto it, or one of the most, is how you allocate costs for the investment in transmission. And that's where you're going to get less consensus and more disagreement. And I don't claim I'm the guy who can give you the exact solution for how to fix all that. I'm just saying if you want to do permitting reform as standalone and not let these other ancillary issues be brought in, that will move the permitting reform forward. But those ancillary issues are really important too, because when you spend, billions of dollars on high voltage transmission lines in this country, you got to figure out how you're going to recover the costs. So I'm not dismissing that issue. I'm just saying right now we're using there's an old saying in Congress that if you see one train leaving the station, jump on it with whatever bill you have. And maybe if we could just look at permitting only, we'd have a better chance of having that train reach its destination.
Well, let's just quickly cover a couple areas before we wrap up, because I agree with your call out on really the significant issue around supply chain. I think a lot of the industry woke up essentially kind of on the outskirts of the pandemic, realizing how interconnected global economies were and, things getting caught up that we never thought could have happened. And we've never really gotten our feet under ourselves on things being smooth in the supply chain. I mean, transformers and substations are absolutely still way backlogged. Now you've got a massive backlog on turbines, but to your point, everything's costing more right now. What can be done? Like, what are some of the things that we can do to put one foot in front of the other to maybe stop the massive surge in prices and continue to bring critical components onshore? I mean, I think a lot of people know what we want to do, but we don't know really right now how to solve things.
I think from a public policy perspective, the best tools in the toolbox are really creating various incentives to encourage development of more manufacturing capacity in this country.
Yeah.
I know that sounds simple, but I really think that's where we need to look, because it wasn't just COVID caused this disruption on a global scale, but at the same time, now we're in this period of rapid demand increase for the electric system. So it's kind of the double whammy. It's like the supply chain is messed up, and at the same time, we need even more and more of all these products, and it wasn't set up to meet that demand. And so if there's federal policy to encourage enhanced capacity for all these parts, and there's a lot of different constituent parts in the electric grid that need this. So easy for me to say that in a general sense, harder to actually implement in a real sense. But again, if we want to achieve, as this administration advocates, energy dominance, that capacity to meet these needs from a supply chain standpoint is a critical factor.
100%. All right, I'm going to ask you an open-ended question to wrap, so you can take it really kind of wherever you want. Lots of latitude here. We've talked a lot about various challenges and opportunities today. But what makes co-ops, what makes smaller grid operators really special for meeting this moment that we're in right now?
I think the cooperative model creates a platform for flexibility and for 100% consumer focus on making decisions. I think that gives you a unity of purpose, if you will. electric cooperatives also have an ability to either do something on their own when they're real small or band together as a group. And when the situation calls for one or the other, they make those decisions. But that flexibility of scaling up or scaling down on how many people are doing this at one time, it gives co-ops a degree of opportunity that I think is unique in the utility sector. I also think that the overall governance model of cooperatives, where you got these distribution cooperatives that are the board of a generation transmission cooperative, we're not totally vertically integrated utilities, but there is this governance relationship that does allow for that understanding of the needs of both the generation transmission versus distribution, which sometimes, if they're not talking to each other, you have a problem. So I like where co-ops are structured. I like their governance model. And, the fact that they're willing to look and embrace innovation, I think is more important now than it's ever been, because technology is developing at a faster rate in 2026 than it has in our lifetimes. And it's only going to start going faster and faster, in my opinion. So I like where we are in terms of the future.
Jim Matheson, NRECA, thanks for being on with us and sharing your thoughts.
Okay, I enjoyed it.
Thanks again to our season sponsor, Virtual Peaker. If you enjoy Grid Pulse, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform, give us a like or a review, and tell your colleagues. You can listen to all episodes and learn more about our efforts to advance the grid at gridforward.org.